The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Charleston, South Carolina, in the sweltering summer of 1852. Within the grand estate of the Whitmore family, a mansion of white columns and sprawling gardens that spoke of old money and older cruelties, a particular form of suffering was about to unfold. The house stood as a monument to the peculiar institution that had built the South's wealth, slavery, and within its walls, the hierarchies of bondage created layers of power and powerlessness that could destroy souls in ways even chains could not. If you're finding this story compelling, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel. We bring forgotten histories to light, one story at a time. And drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. We love hearing from our global audience. Inside the kitchen house, separated from the main residence by a covered walkway, Marcus stood at a wooden workbench, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he prepared breakfast for the household. At 32 years old, he carried himself with a dignity that years of enslavement had not entirely erased, though it had certainly tried. His skin bore the scars of past punishments, thin white lines across his back that told stories he never spoke aloud. His eyes, dark and intelligent, held a careful blankness that enslaved people learned to adopt as armor against the daily indignities of their existence. Marcus had been born into slavery on a plantation in Virginia, but after his first master's death, he had been sold south to settle debts. That sale had separated him from his mother and two sisters, a severing he felt every single day like a wound that never healed. He arrived at the Whitmore estate 8 years ago, purchased along with his wife, Sarah, in what the Whitmores considered a generous act of keeping a married couple together. But generosity was a strange word for a transaction that treated human beings as property, and Marcus knew that what could be given could just as easily be taken away. Sarah worked in the main house as a seamstress and lady's maid, her skilled fingers mending the elaborate dresses and maintaining the wardrobe of the Whitmore women. She was 28, with a gentle face and hands that trembled slightly whenever Mrs. Catherine Whitmore entered the room. The mistress of the house had a reputation among the enslaved population for capricious cruelty, for punishments that seemed to arise from boredom rather than any actual transgression. Sarah had learned to make herself as invisible as possible, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to exist as a shadow that performed its duties and then disappeared. The Whitmore household consisted of James Whitmore, the patriarch, a cotton merchant whose wealth had grown considerably during the boom years of the 1840s, his wife Catherine, 10 years his junior and widely regarded among Charleston society as a beauty with refined tastes, and their 2 children, both away at boarding schools in the north. The estate employed, if such a word could be used for forced labor, 15 enslaved people who maintained the house, gardens, and stables. James traveled frequently for business, often spending weeks at a time in New Orleans or Savannah, leaving Catherine to manage the household and its human property. On this particular morning, as Marcus arranged fresh bread, butter, and preserves on a silver tray, he heard the bell ring from the main house. 2 sharp pulls that signaled Mrs. Whitmore required immediate service. He wiped his hands on his apron and carried the tray across the walkway, his footsteps silent on the wooden boards. The heat was already oppressive, and humidity hung in the air like a wet blanket, making every breath feel labored. Inside the dining room, Catherine Whitmore sat at the head of the long mahogany table, her morning dress a confection of pale blue silk and white lace. She was 35 but looked younger, her blonde hair arranged in elaborate curls, her skin pale from careful avoidance of the sun that darkened the complexions of those who worked her fields and tended her gardens. She did not look up as Marcus entered, a deliberate display of the social death that slavery imposed, the rendering of human beings into objects unworthy of basic acknowledgement. "You're slow this morning," she said, her voice carrying that particular southern drawl that could make even criticism sound almost melodious. "I've been waiting." Marcus knew better than to point out that he had arrived within 2 minutes of the bell. "My apologies, ma'am," he said, setting the tray on the sideboard and beginning to arrange the breakfast service on the table before her. Catherine picked up her coffee cup, took a sip, and set it down with enough force to rattle the saucer. "Cold," she announced. "Completely cold. Are you trying to serve me cold coffee, Marcus?" The coffee was not cold. Steam still rose visibly from the cup, but Marcus had learned years ago that truth was a luxury enslaved people could not afford. "I'll bring fresh immediately, ma'am," he said, reaching for the cup. Her hand shot out and gripped his wrist. Her fingers were small, delicate, adorned with rings that pressed into his skin. "Did I say you could touch it?" she asked, her blue eyes meeting his for the first time that morning. There was something in her gaze that Marcus had seen before, a hunger that had nothing to do with breakfast, a desire to exert power for its own sake, to watch someone squirm under the weight of her authority. "No, ma'am," Marcus said, keeping his voice level, his eyes lowered. She released his wrist and waved her hand dismissively. "Send Sarah to me. I need to discuss the alterations on my green dress. And, Marcus?" She paused until he looked at her again. "When I ring for service, I expect you to run. Walking is for people who have the luxury of time. You do not." Marcus nodded and left the room, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. He crossed back to the kitchen house and found Sarah emerging from the wash house, carrying a basket of linens. Her face brightened when she saw him, then immediately dimmed as she read his expression. "Mrs. Whitmore?" she asked. "Wants to see you about the green dress," Marcus said, reaching out to squeeze her hand briefly. A small gesture of connection in a world that sought to deny them even that. "Be careful. She's in one of her moods." Sarah nodded, set down the basket, and smoothed her apron. Marcus watched her walk toward the main house, her shoulders squared despite the fear he knew she carried. They had been married for 10 years, married in the way enslaved people married, without legal recognition, without protection, with only their commitment to each other, and the blessing of the elder enslaved people on the plantation who performed ceremonies the law refused to acknowledge. They had no children, a fact that carried both grief and relief. How could they bring a child into a world where that child would be property, could be sold away on a master's whim? As Sarah disappeared into the house, Marcus returned to his work, scrubbing pots with more force than necessary, trying to wash away the humiliation of the morning encounter. The other enslaved people in the kitchen gave him space, recognizing the tight set of his shoulders, the way his movements had become sharp and controlled. They all knew these moods, had all experienced them, the aftermath of being reminded once again that they were not considered fully human by those who owned them. An hour later, Sarah had not returned. Marcus tried not to worry. Alterations discussions could take time, as Mrs. Whitmore often changed her mind multiple times about details, but something gnawed at him, an uneasiness that grew with each passing minute. He was preparing the midday meal when he heard a sound from the main house, a cry that was quickly muffled, then silence. His hands froze over the vegetables he was chopping. The other enslaved people in the kitchen exchanged glances. Old Thomas, who managed the stables and had been on the Whitmore estate for 30 years, moved to the doorway and looked toward the main house. "Best stay here," he said quietly to Marcus. "Ain't nothing good comes from getting between the mistress and whatever she's about." But Marcus couldn't stay. He set down his knife, removed his apron, and walked toward the main house. He knew he was risking punishment, knew that an enslaved man entering the house uninvited could face a whipping or worse, but the cry he had heard belonged to Sarah, and 10 years of marriage. Their 10 years of being each other's only anchor in a sea of suffering meant he could not simply stand by. He entered through the kitchen door and moved silently through the house, following the sound of voices to Mrs. Whitmore's private sitting room. The door was slightly ajar, and what he saw through the gap made his blood run cold. Sarah stood in the center of the room, tears streaming down her face, while Mrs. Whitmore circled her like a predator examining prey. The green dress in question lay draped over a chair, forgotten. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Mrs. Whitmore was saying, her voice low and venomous. "You think I don't notice the way you look at my things, the way you touch my dresses with your dirty hands, imagining yourself wearing them?" "No, ma'am, I never—" Sarah began, but Mrs. Whitmore cut her off with a raised hand. "Don't lie to me. I see everything in this house, everything." She moved closer to Sarah, reaching out to grab a fistful of Sarah's hair, forcing her head back. "You need to remember your place. You are nothing. You own nothing. Even that husband of yours, Marcus, isn't it? Even he isn't really yours. He belongs to me. You belong to me. Your very breath belongs to me." Marcus felt his hands curl into fists, his entire body tensing with rage. He wanted to burst into the room, to pull Mrs. Whitmore away from his wife, to shout that they were human beings, not property, not things to be used and degraded, but he knew what would happen if he did. An enslaved man, laying hands on a white woman, even in defense of his wife, would mean death, not just for him but likely for Sarah as well. They would both be made examples, their bodies displayed as warnings to others who might forget their place in the racial hierarchy that structured Southern society. So Marcus stood frozen in the hallway, his impotence a weight that threatened to crush him, watching through the crack in the door as Mrs. Whitmore continued her psychological torture. She released Sarah's hair and walked to her writing desk, opening a drawer and removing a piece of paper. "Mr. Whitmore will be returning from New Orleans next week," Catherine said, her tone now conversational, almost pleasant. "I've been thinking about some changes to the household. We need fresh blood, so to speak. That plantation in Georgia that James has been corresponding with, they have some promising young bucks for sale. I was thinking we might purchase one or two and perhaps send some of our current stock south to the sugar plantations. I hear they always need workers there, though the life expectancy is rather short. Something about the heat and the work conditions." Sarah's face had gone pale. "Please, ma'am. I'm particularly thinking about your Marcus," Mrs. Whitmore continued, examining her nails with studied casualness. "He's been here 8 years now, hasn't he? Getting a bit long in the tooth for household work. Might be time for him to experience real labor. The sugar plantations in Louisiana pay good prices for experienced slaves. Of course, they don't typically purchase married couples. Too much trouble. All that emotional attachment makes them difficult to manage." The threat was clear, deliberate, designed to inflict maximum psychological pain. Marcus felt something inside him crack, felt the careful control he had maintained for years begin to fracture. He had survived 8 years of slavery by keeping his head down, by performing his duties without complaint, by swallowing his rage and his grief and his humanity. But listening to this woman casually discuss destroying what little he and Sarah had built together, discussing it as if they were cattle to be separated for convenience, pushed him past a boundary he didn't know existed until he crossed it. He must have made a sound, a gasp, a sharp intake of breath, because suddenly Mrs. Whitmore's head snapped toward the door. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "Show yourself immediately!" Marcus had a choice in that moment. He could run, could return to the kitchen and pretend he hadn't heard, hadn't seen, but running felt like another form of death, another way of letting slavery kill him piece by piece. So instead, he pushed open the door and stepped into the room, meeting Mrs. Whitmore's startled gaze, with eyes that no longer held careful blankness, but instead burned with undisguised contempt. "Marcus," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with horror. She knew what this meant, knew that his presence here, his expression, the way he stood with shoulders squared rather than hunched in submission, all of it spelled disaster. Mrs. Whitmore's face went through a rapid series of expressions, surprise, fear, and then rage. "How dare you!" she hissed, backing toward the writing desk where a small bell sat. "How dare you enter my private rooms uninvited? You forget yourself, Marcus. You forget what you are." "I know exactly what I am," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "I'm a man. My wife is a woman. We're human beings, not property you can threaten and torment for your amusement." The words hung in the air, revolutionary and dangerous. Sarah made a small sound of despair. Mrs. Whitmore's hand found the bell and she rang it frantically, the sharp peals cutting through the afternoon quiet. Marcus heard footsteps running from various parts of the house, the overseer, other enslaved people, the machinery of the plantation responding to the mistress's alarm. But Marcus didn't run. He stood his ground, looking at Catherine Whitmore with all the humanity she had tried to deny him, and in that moment, he was free, not legally, not physically, but in the most important way. He had spoken truth to power, had refused to play the role assigned to him by a system built on lies about human worth and racial hierarchies. The overseer, a brutal man named Crawford, who carried a whip on his belt like a mark of office, burst into the room with 2 other men behind him. He took in the scene, Mrs. Whitmore pale and shaking, Sarah weeping, Marcus standing in the center of the room with his head held high and his face darkened with understanding. "He threatened me," Mrs. Whitmore said immediately, her voice trembling with what might have been genuine fear or might have been performative hysteria designed to ensure maximum punishment. "He came into my private rooms and spoke to me with violence in his eyes. I want him whipped, 20 lashes, no 30, and then I want him sold. Tomorrow. I will not have such insubordination on my property." Crawford grabbed Marcus by the arm, his grip like iron. "You damn fool," he muttered, low enough that only Marcus could hear. "You know what you've done. You've killed yourself and probably your wife too." As Marcus was dragged from the room, he looked back at Sarah one last time. She stood frozen, tears streaming down her face, her hand pressed against her mouth to stifle the sobs. He tried to convey everything he felt in that single glance, his love for her, his sorrow at the pain his action would cause her, his desperate hope that somehow, someday, they might both find freedom. But words were impossible now, and even if they hadn't been, what words could possibly be adequate for a goodbye that should never have to happen? The whipping post stood in the side yard, visible from the quarters where the enslaved people lived, positioned deliberately as a monument to terror and control. It was a thick wooden beam sunk deep into the ground, worn smooth by years of use, its surface stained dark with the blood of countless victims. Marcus had seen others tied to it, had heard their screams carry across the grounds, had witnessed the aftermath, broken bodies and broken spirits that served as reminders of what resistance cost in a system designed to crush any assertion of humanity. Now it was his turn. Crawford and his men stripped Marcus of his shirt and bound his wrists to the iron rings embedded in the post, pulling his arms taut above his head until his toes barely touched the ground. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and Marcus could feel sweat already beginning to run down his back, the back that would soon be torn open by leather and metal. He closed his eyes and tried to find some place inside himself where he could retreat, some sanctuary of the mind where the pain couldn't reach. But he knew from watching others that there was no such place. That pain of this magnitude invaded every corner of consciousness and left nothing untouched. A crowd had gathered, not by choice but by requirement. Mrs. Whitmore insisted that all the enslaved people witness punishments, believing that shared trauma created collective obedience. They stood in a semicircle around the post, their faces carefully blank, eyes downcast. But Marcus could feel their silent solidarity, their shared grief, the way they held themselves rigid against the violence they were being forced to witness. Among them stood Sarah, held in place by old Thomas, who had one gnarled hand on her shoulder to keep her from running forward, from throwing herself between Marcus and the whip in a futile gesture that would only add to the day's casualties. Mrs. Whitmore emerged from the house, her earlier agitation replaced by cold composure. She had changed into a different dress, as if the morning's events had somehow soiled her previous attire. She positioned herself on the veranda where she could observe the punishment from a comfortable distance, settling into a wicker chair that a house servant hastily provided. Her face showed no emotion, not anger, not satisfaction, just a terrible blankness that Marcus found more disturbing than rage would have been. This was simply business to her, a matter of property management, no different than breaking a horse that had shown signs of rebelliousness. Crawford stepped forward, uncoiling his whip, a 9-foot length of braided leather with metal tips designed to tear flesh. He had built a reputation across several plantations as a man who could break the most defiant slaves, and he took pride in his work the way craftsmen took pride in fine carpentry or skilled blacksmithing. 30 lashes, he announced, his voice carrying across the yard, for insubordination, for entering the mistress's private rooms without permission, and for speaking with disrespect to his betters. The first lash came without warning, cutting across Marcus's back in a line of fire that stole his breath. He had thought he was prepared, had thought he could endure in silence, but the pain was beyond anything he had imagined. Not just the physical agony of torn skin, but the psychological assault of being reduced to flesh, to a body that could be damaged at another's whim. The second lash followed immediately, crossing the first, and Marcus heard himself cry out, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere outside himself, from some animal part of his brain that responded to suffering with pure vocalization. Sarah's scream echoed his own. "Please!" she shouted, her voice breaking. "Please, Mrs. Whitmore, he meant no harm. He was only worried about me. Please stop this." Mrs. Whitmore didn't even look in her direction. "Someone silence that woman," she said calmly, "or she'll join her husband at the post." Old Thomas pulled Sarah back, whispering urgently in her ear, and her screams became muffled sobs. Marcus tried to focus on her voice, tried to use it as an anchor to keep himself present, to keep the pain from fragmenting his consciousness entirely. He counted the lashes, 3, 4, 5, each one adding a new layer of agony to his back. By the 10th lash his vision had begun to blur. By the 15th he could taste blood in his mouth where he had bitten his tongue. Crawford was methodical, spacing each lash to allow maximum pain, varying the angle to ensure even coverage across Marcus's back. This was not punishment delivered in hot anger, but calculated torture designed to break both body and will. Marcus's legs gave out around the 20th lash, leaving him hanging by his wrists, his full weight pulling at his shoulders in a different kind of agony that competed with the fire across his back. Through the haze of pain, Marcus became aware of whispers among the gathered enslaved people, low murmurs that carried a dangerous undertone. He couldn't make out words, but he recognized the tone, anger, barely suppressed rage that mirrored his own earlier defiance. Crawford heard it too. He paused before the 25th lash and turned to face the crowd. "Anyone else want to join him?" he asked. his voice deceptively mild. "Anyone else feeling bold today? Because I've got plenty of arm left and Mrs. Whitmore seems to be in a generous mood when it comes to discipline." The whispers stopped, but the silence that replaced them felt heavier, more volatile than speech. Marcus could sense it even through his pain, something shifting in the collective consciousness of the enslaved community, some boundary being approached that once crossed could not be uncrossed. For years they had endured through passive resistance, through small acts of sabotage, through the cultivation of inner lives that slavery could not touch. But there were limits to endurance, thresholds of suffering beyond which human beings could not be pushed without something fundamental breaking. Crawford delivered the final 5 lashes in rapid succession, as if sensing the dangerous mood and wanting to conclude the spectacle before it spiraled beyond his control. The 30th lash fell, and then there was silence. Not peaceful silence, but the stunned quiet that follows extreme violence when the world seems to hold its breath in horror at what humans are capable of doing to one another. Marcus hung from the post, barely conscious, his back a ruin of torn flesh and flowing blood. Crawford cut him down with a knife, and he collapsed to the ground, unable to stand, unable to do anything but lie in the dirt, and try to remember how to breathe through the all-consuming pain. He was dimly aware of Sarah breaking free from old Thomas's restraining hand and rushing to his side, her tears falling on his face as she cradled his head in her lap. "Get him to the quarters," Mrs. Whitmore said, rising from her chair. "Clean him up enough that he doesn't bleed all over everything. And Sarah," she paused, looking down at the couple with cold eyes, "consider this your warning. Your husband's punishment is because of his actions, but you share responsibility for not controlling him. A good wife keeps her husband humble. Remember that." Several of the enslaved men came forward to help, lifting Marcus as gently as possible, though any movement sent fresh waves of agony through his torn back. They carried him to the quarters, a row of small cabins that housed the plantation's enslaved population, and laid him face down on the pallet he shared with Sarah. Women came with water and clean rags, with what little medicine they had managed to gather over years of treating injuries that the white owners considered too minor to warrant a doctor's attention. Old Martha, who served as the unofficial healer among the enslaved community, took charge. She was 70 years old, had been enslaved since birth, had buried 3 husbands and 5 children, all lost to the casual cruelties of the system. Her hands were gentle but competent as she began cleaning Marcus's wounds, murmuring prayers under her breath, calling on God and ancestors to give this young man strength to survive. "It's bad," she said quietly to Sarah. "Worse than most I've seen. Crawford's been perfecting his craft. Some of these cuts go deep, might get infected if we're not careful." She mixed a poultice from herbs she kept hidden in her cabin, ingredients gathered from the woods beyond the plantation boundaries, where the old knowledge of African medicine persisted, despite efforts to erase it. "This will help, but he needs rest, weeks of it, maybe months before he can work properly again." Sarah knelt beside the pallet, holding Marcus's hand, her face streaked with tears and dirt. "What were you thinking?" she whispered, though whether she was asking him or herself wasn't clear. "What possessed you to speak to her like that?" Marcus's voice, when it came, was barely audible. Couldn't let her threaten us anymore. Had to show her we're human." "And what good did it do?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "Now you're torn apart and she's already talking about selling you south. How does that make us more human? How does that help?" Marcus had no answer. Perhaps there was no rational answer, no logical justification for what he had done. It had been an act of emotion, of pushed beyond the limit desperation, of a soul that could no longer bear the weight of its own degradation. In the moment, it had felt like freedom, like reclaiming some essential part of himself that slavery sought to destroy. But now, lying with his back torn open, facing the possibility of being sold away from the only person who made life bearable, he wondered if he had been selfish, if his moment of defiance had cost them both more than it was worth. The cabin filled with people as word of the punishment spread. They came in small groups, bringing what little they could offer. A bit of food, a blanket, whispered words of solidarity. Young Benjamin, who worked in the fields, knelt beside the pallet and spoke in a voice tight with anger. "This ain't right," he said. "None of this is right. We outnumber them. Did you ever think about that? There's 15 of us here and only Crawford and maybe 3 other white men on the property when Master Whitmore's away. We could—" "Hush your mouth," old Thomas interrupted sharply. "That kind of talk gets people killed. Remember Nat Turner? Remember what happened after that rebellion up in Virginia? They killed hundreds of colored folks, innocent folks who had nothing to do with it. You want that here? So we just accept it? Benjamin challenged. Just let them whip us and sell us and treat us like animals until we die? The question hung in the air, unanswerable because every answer was impossible. Resistance meant death. Submission meant slow death of the spirit. Escape meant risking recapture and punishments that made today's whipping look merciful. There were no good choices for people trapped in an institution that had spent 2 centuries perfecting methods of control and dehumanization. Martha finished applying the poultice and wrapped Marcus's back in clean cloth. Her movements efficient despite her age. What we do, she said quietly, is survive. We survive because that's how we honor the ones who came before us and didn't make it. We survive because someday, maybe not in our lifetime, but someday, this evil institution will fall, and somebody needs to be alive to remember what was done here, to tell the stories of what we endured. She looked around at the gathered faces, her old eyes still fierce despite decades of suffering. And we take care of each other. That's our resistance. Loving each other when they tell us we're not capable of love. Building families when they try to tear us apart. Holding on to our humanity when they try to strip it away. Marcus here, he did something today that was brave and foolish in equal measure. But he did it because he loves his wife. Because he couldn't stand to hear her threatened. That's human. That's what they can't take from us unless we let them. The words settled over the room like a benediction. People nodded, some wiping away tears, others clenching their fists in silent determination. Slowly they began to file out, returning to their cabins or their duties, leaving Marcus and Sarah alone with old Martha and old Thomas. Night fell over the plantation, bringing with it a chorus of insects and the distant sound of singing from one of the cabins, spirituals that carried coded messages of resistance and hope, songs that spoke of freedom in religious terms that the white owners considered harmless, but that meant something entirely different to those who sang them. Sarah lay down carefully beside Marcus, positioning herself so she wouldn't disturb his injured back, and listened to his labored breathing in the darkness. "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered into the night. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm not entirely. What you did was terrifying and dangerous, and might cost us everything. But for one moment you looked at her like she wasn't a god, like she didn't have the right to do what she was doing. I saw it in your eyes, Marcus. You were free. For one moment, you were completely free." Marcus felt tears sliding down his face, mixing with the sweat and dirt. "What if that one moment costs us all our other moments together? Then we'll face that when it comes," Sarah said firmly. "But right now, you're alive, and I'm here, and we still have tonight. That's something. In this place, that's everything." They lay together in the darkness, Marcus's pain a constant presence, the future uncertain and threatening. But for that night, they had each other, and they had the knowledge that despite everything slavery had done to them, it had not succeeded in destroying their love or their essential humanity. It was a small victory, perhaps meaningless in the grand scheme of their powerlessness, but it was theirs. And in a world that sought to deny them ownership of anything, even their own bodies, that mattered more than words could express. 3 days passed in a haze of fever and pain. Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness, his body fighting infection that old Martha treated with her carefully hoarded herbs and poultices. Sarah remained by his side when her duties allowed, stealing moments between her work in the main house to check on him, to hold water to his cracked lips, to whisper reassurances that neither of them truly believed. The wounds on his back had begun to heal in some places, but several of the deeper cuts showed signs of festering despite Martha's best efforts. On the 4th morning, Marcus woke to find his fever had broken. The cabin was empty except for him. The others had already gone to their various assignments. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the wooden walls, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it, gasping as the movement pulled at his healing wounds. But the pain, while intense, was different now. No longer the all-consuming fire of the first days, but something more manageable, more specific. The door opened and Sarah entered, carrying a bowl of thin gruel and a cup of water. Her face lit up when she saw him awake and lucid. "Your fever broke," she said, setting down the food and pressing her palm against his forehead to confirm. "Thank God. Martha said yesterday if it didn't break soon, we might lose you." Marcus reached for her hand and held it against his cheek. "I'm too stubborn to die," he said, his voice rough from days of fever-induced delirium. "Besides, I haven't finished annoying Mrs. Whitmore yet." Sarah made a sound between a laugh and a sob. "Don't even joke about that. Marcus, she hasn't forgotten. She's been asking questions. Where you're from originally, whether you have family elsewhere, how much you might bring at auction. Crawford's been making inquiries with slave traders in the city. The words dropped like stones into Marcus's stomach. He had known this was coming, had understood from the moment he defied Mrs. Whitmore that the consequences would extend far beyond a whipping. But hearing it confirmed, knowing that the machinery of his sale was already in motion, made it real in a way that abstract fear had not. "When?" he asked. "Master Whitmore returns tomorrow from New Orleans. Mrs. Whitmore will discuss it with him then. She's been careful to document everything. Your insubordination, your threat to her safety. She's building a case for why you're too dangerous to keep, why selling you is a matter of household security rather than her vindictiveness." Sarah's voice carried bitter understanding of how the system worked, how white owners could frame any action by enslaved people in terms that justified whatever punishment they wished to inflict. Marcus struggled to sit up, gritting his teeth against the pain. "Then we don't have much time." "Time for what?" Sarah asked, though something in her eyes suggested she already knew the answer, already feared what he was about to say. "To leave, to run." Marcus spoke the words that had been forming in his mind during his fever dreams, the impossible plan that felt like the only option remaining. "North to freedom, people do it, Sarah. The Underground Railroad, it's not just stories. People make it." Sarah pulled her hand away, standing up and moving to the small window. Outside, the plantation continued its daily rhythms, the sounds of work, of voices, of a system functioning as it had for generations. "And many more don't make it," she said quietly. "They get caught, and what happens to them makes your whipping look gentle. They get sold to the Deep South, to places where the life expectancy is measured in years rather than decades, or they get killed as examples. So we stay and let them separate us," Marcus challenged. "Let them sell me to Louisiana sugar plantations where I'll be worked to death in 2 years. At least if we run, we have a chance. If we stay, we have none." Sarah turned to face him, her expression torn between hope and terror. "What about the others? If we run and get caught, Mrs. Whitmore will take it out on everyone here. You know how it works. Collective punishment to discourage future attempts." It was true, Marcus had seen it happen on other plantations, had heard the stories of how one person's escape attempt led to increased restrictions and punishments for those who remained. The system was designed to make individual freedom feel selfish, to burden runaways with guilt over those left behind. But Marcus was beginning to understand that this was just another form of control, another way slavery maintained itself, by turning its victims against each other. "The others want to resist," Marcus said, thinking of young Benjamin's angry words, of the dangerous undertone he had sensed in the crowd during his punishment. "I heard it in their voices, saw it in their faces. Maybe us running, maybe showing that escape is possible, maybe that's not abandoning them, maybe it's inspiring them." Before Sarah could respond, the door burst open and old Thomas entered, his face grave. "They're coming," he said urgently. "Crawford and 2 other men, heading this way. Mrs. Whitmore sent them to check on you. Make sure you're well enough to be moved to the holding cell in town. She wants you locked up there until the sale is finalized." The holding cell, a stone building in Charleston where enslaved people awaiting sale or punishment were kept in conditions that made the plantation cabins look comfortable. Marcus had seen it once during a rare trip to the city with his previous master, had seen the iron bars and heard the sounds from within, and had understood that it was designed to break spirits before bodies were sold to new owners. Marcus looked at Sarah, then at Thomas. A decision crystallized in his mind, born from desperation and the clarity that sometimes comes when all other options have been exhausted. "Help us," he said to Thomas. "Tonight. We run tonight." Thomas's weathered face showed conflict, decades of caution warring with something else, some spark that Marcus's defiance had ignited. "That's a death sentence if you're caught," he said. "It's a death sentence if I stay," Marcus countered. "Maybe slower, but just as final. Please, Thomas, you've been here 30 years. You've seen how this ends. Help us try for something different." The old man was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus could see the internal debate playing out across his features. Then slowly Thomas nodded. "I know someone," he said quietly. "A free black man in Charleston who helps runaways sometimes. Name's Abraham. He works at the docks. If you can get to the city, to a tavern called the Anchor, he might be able to help you get on a ship heading north. But Marcus, Sarah, if you do this, you can never come back. You understand that? Everything and everyone you know here, you'll never see again." This is a crucial moment in our story. If you're finding this narrative powerful and want to see more forgotten histories brought to light, please hit that like button and consider subscribing. We have so many more stories to tell. And drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us. Marcus reached for Sarah's hand. "What do you say?" I won't force this. If you want to stay, if the risk is too much, I'll understand, but I can't stay here anymore. Something in me broke when I spoke to Mrs. Whitmore, and I can't put it back together. I'd rather die trying to be free than live another 30 years as property." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "I married you because I saw in you someone who refused to be completely broken by this system. If we run and die trying, at least we die together. At least we die having tried." She squeezed his hand. "I'm with you, whatever comes." Thomas moved to the door, checking outside to ensure Crawford hadn't arrived yet. "Then here's what we do. Tonight there's a prayer meeting in the woods. Mrs. Whitmore allows them because she thinks religion keeps us docile. Most everyone will be there. I'll make sure Crawford knows about it. Suggest he should attend to keep watch over the slaves. While everyone's distracted, you two slip away toward the eastern boundary of the property. There's a path through the marsh that leads toward the main road. It's treacherous. You'll be walking through water in places, but the dogs can't track through water." "Dogs," Sarah said, her face paling. The sound of bloodhounds was every enslaved person's nightmare. The baying that meant hunters were closing in, that recapture and punishment were imminent. "They won't set the dogs until morning when they realize you're gone," Thomas said. "That gives you maybe 8 hours head start. It's not much, but it's something. You'll need to move fast, stick to water and hard ground where possible, and get to Charleston before dawn. The city's chaos in the early morning. Ships loading and unloading, merchants setting up. Enough confusion that 2 more black folks won't be immediately noticed." Marcus tried to stand, wincing as his back protested. The wounds had closed enough that he wouldn't bleed through his shirt, but every movement pulled at the healing tissue. He would have to ignore the pain, would have to find reserves of strength he wasn't sure he possessed. "What about travel papers?" he asked. "If we're stopped, we'll need documents proving we're allowed to travel." Thomas reached into his shirt and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. "These were my sons," he said quietly, "before he was sold away 20 years ago. They're old, but most patrol folks don't look too careful if you seem confident. The name's wrong, but in the dark that might not matter." He handed the papers to Marcus. "I've been carrying these for 2 decades, telling myself I'd use them someday to go find him, but I'm too old now, too tired. You take them, make them mean something." Marcus took the papers with shaking hands, understanding the weight of what Thomas was giving up. Not just physical documents, but hope itself, the dream of reunion that had sustained him through years of separation from his child. "Thomas, Don't," the old man interrupted. "Don't say anything, just make it, get north, find freedom, and remember us. Remember all of us still here, still trapped. Tell people what you saw, what was done to us. That's how you repay me." Crawford's voice called out from across the yard. "Thomas, where's that boy Marcus? The mistress wants him moved to town today." Thomas gripped Marcus's shoulder once, firmly, then called back. "Coming," he lowered his voice. "Tonight, prayer meeting starts at sundown. You leave when you hear the singing start, and Marcus, God go with you both." He left the cabin, and Marcus and Sarah were alone with the enormity of what they were planning. In less than 12 hours, they would either be on their way to freedom or dead, or worse, recaptured and facing punishments that would make Marcus's whipping seem merciful. There was no middle ground, no safe option, no way to hedge their bets. They were gambling everything on a desperate run through darkness, guided by nothing but hope and the human need to be free. Sarah began gathering what little they could take: a spare shirt for Marcus, a small knife she used for sewing, a tin cup they could use to collect water. Everything had to fit in their pockets or be easily concealed, nothing that would mark them as runaways if they were questioned. Marcus watched her move through the cabin, memorizing her face, the way her hands moved, the determined set of her jaw. If this was their last day together, he wanted to remember every detail. "I love you," he said suddenly. The words inadequate but necessary. Sarah stopped her preparations and came to him, cupping his face in her hands. "I know," she said. "I've always known. That's why I'm doing this with you. Not out of duty or fear, but because 10 years ago when we were married, I promised to walk beside you wherever the path led, even if it leads into darkness." They spent the day making their preparations, subtle and careful, aware that any sign of their intentions could doom them before they even tried. Sarah went about her duties in the main house, maintaining her usual demeanor despite the fear churning in her stomach. Marcus rested, conserving his strength, forcing himself to eat the meager rations despite his lack of appetite. He would need every bit of energy his body could provide for the night ahead. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed almost like a warning, the enslaved community began making their way toward the clearing in the woods, where they held their prayer meetings. These gatherings were the only time they were allowed to assemble without direct white supervision, the only space where they could express their faith in their own terms, sing their own songs, speak words that weren't monitored and controlled. Crawford stood near the path to the woods, his arms crossed, watching the procession with suspicious eyes. But Thomas had done his work well. Crawford believed he was there to monitor a religious gathering, to ensure the enslaved people weren't planning anything rebellious under the cover of prayer. It never occurred to him that the real rebellion would happen in the quarter he was leaving unguarded. As the last of the enslaved people filed past, Marcus and Sarah slipped out of their cabin, moving through lengthening shadows toward the eastern boundary of the property. They could hear singing beginning in the woods behind them, old spirituals that carried dual meanings, songs about crossing over Jordan that were simultaneously about death and freedom, about biblical deliverance and contemporary escape. The path Thomas had described began at the edge of the cultivated fields, a barely visible track that led into marsh and undergrowth. Marcus took Sarah's hand, and they stepped forward together, leaving behind everything they had known, walking into an uncertain future with nothing but their determination to be free and their love for each other to light the way. The marsh at night was a different world, alien and treacherous. Water reached mid-calf in places, dark and opaque, hiding roots and holes that threatened to twist ankles or worse. The air hung thick with humidity and the smell of decay, vegetation rotting in stagnant pools, the fecund scent of earth that never fully dried. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds, biting any exposed skin, and nightbirds called out from the darkness in voices that sounded almost human, almost like warnings. Marcus and Sarah moved as quickly as they dared, which meant moving slowly and carefully, testing each step before committing their weight. Marcus's back screamed protest with every movement, the healing wounds pulling and threatening to reopen. He could feel moisture seeping through his shirt, whether sweat or blood or marsh water. He couldn't tell and didn't want to know. Sarah stayed close behind him, one hand gripping the back of his shirt, using him as a guide through the darkness. They had been walking for perhaps an hour when they heard the first sounds of alarm from the plantation behind them, distant shouts, the ringing of the bell that signaled emergency. Someone had checked the cabin and found them gone. Marcus felt his heart rate spike, felt the animal panic of prey, knowing the hunters were aware, were mobilizing, were coming. He quickened his pace despite the danger, despite the darkness, driven by the knowledge that their head start was now being measured in minutes rather than hours. "They know," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Keep moving," Marcus urged. "The dogs can't track through water. As long as we stay in the marsh, we have a chance." But even as he spoke the words, he wondered if they were true. He had heard stories of dogs that could track across water, of hunters so skilled they could follow any trail. How much of what enslaved people told each other about escape was fact, and how much was wishful thinking? There was no way to know, no database of successful escape techniques they could reference. They were operating on hope and rumor, making life and death decisions based on information that might be completely wrong. The marsh seemed endless. Every time Marcus thought they must be reaching solid ground, the path would turn and lead them deeper into wetland. His legs ached from the constant resistance of water, from the uneven footing that required muscles to constantly adjust and compensate. Sarah was breathing hard behind him, struggling to keep up, but she never complained, never asked to rest. They both understood that stopping now meant capture, meant facing consequences that would be worse than death. After what felt like hours but was probably closer to 2, the ground finally began to rise beneath their feet. The water receded to ankles, then disappeared entirely as they climbed onto a low ridge of solid earth. Marcus allowed himself a moment to rest, leaning against a tree while Sarah caught her breath. In the distance behind them, they could see lights, torches moving across the plantation grounds, the search beginning in earnest. "How far to Charleston?" Sarah asked between gasps for air. Marcus tried to orient himself in the darkness. He had traveled to the city a few times with previous masters, but always by main road in daylight, and he had not been paying attention to landmarks that might help in a midnight flight through wilderness. "Maybe 10 miles, he guessed. "Maybe more. We need to reach it before dawn, before the workday starts and the roads fill with people who'll question why we're traveling." They pushed on, leaving the marsh behind and entering forest that was slightly easier to navigate but offered its own dangers. Low branches caught at clothes and skin. Roots reached up to trip unwary feet, and always behind them, the knowledge that pursuit was coming, that men with dogs and guns were following their trail. Around midnight, they reached the main road that led to Charleston. Marcus hesitated at the edge of the tree line, studying the pale ribbon of packed dirt that disappeared into darkness in both directions. Roads were dangerous for runaways. They were patrolled by militia, traveled by people who would ask questions. Places where two enslaved people walking alone at night would immediately attract suspicion. But staying in the forest meant slower progress, meant they might not reach the city before dawn revealed them to hostile eyes. "We take the road," Marcus decided. "We move fast, and if we see anyone coming, we hide. The papers Thomas gave us. If we're stopped, we act confident. We're traveling on our master's business, carrying a message to Charleston. People see what they expect to see. If we act like we have permission to be here, maybe they'll believe it." It was thin reasoning, and they both knew it. But thin reasoning was all they had, and standing paralyzed by fear would guarantee their capture. Sarah nodded, and together they stepped out onto the road, leaving the relative safety of the forest behind. They walked quickly, almost jogging, eating up the miles with desperate urgency. The night air was cooler on the road, without the oppressive humidity of the marsh, and the even surface made walking easier despite Marcus's injuries. The stars overhead were brilliant, unobscured by tree canopy, and Marcus found himself looking up at them, thinking about freedom, real freedom, not just the absence of an immediate master, but the ability to look at stars and know that no one owned you, that your labor and your body and your future were your own. They had covered perhaps 5 miles when they heard hoofbeats behind them, multiple horses moving fast. Marcus grabbed Sarah's hand, and they dove into the brush beside the road, pressing themselves flat against the ground behind a fallen log. The horses thundered past, and in the brief moment of visibility, Marcus saw Crawford on the lead horse, his face set in grim determination, a rifle across his saddle. Behind him rode 2 other men, and behind them, barely visible in the darkness, shapes that might have been dogs. Sarah's hand found Marcus's and squeezed so hard it hurt. They lay frozen, not daring to breathe, as the riders continued down the road toward Charleston. After the sound of hoofbeats faded, they remained still for several minutes more, ensuring the riders weren't doubling back, that this wasn't a trap. "They're ahead of us now," Sarah whispered. "Between us and the city." Marcus's mind raced. Crawford had assumed they would head for Charleston. It was the logical destination, the place where ships departed for northern ports, where the Underground Railroad maintained contacts. But if the hunters were positioned between them and their goal, walking straight toward them would be suicide. "We go around," Marcus said, though even as he spoke he was calculating the additional time that would require, the additional risk. "There are rice plantations to the west of the main road. We cut through their fields, come at Charleston from a different angle. It's longer, but if Crawford's watching the main approach, it might be our only chance." They left the road and struck out across country, navigating by the stars and by occasional glimpses of distant lights that marked plantations or farmhouses. The landscape here was cultivated, rice fields that had been drained for the season, their stubble crunching underfoot with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the night quiet. They passed within sight of plantation houses, close enough to hear dogs barking at their passage, close enough to see lamplight in windows, and imagine the enslaved people inside those walls. Trapped in the same system, Marcus and Sarah were risking everything to escape. Dawn began to lighten the eastern sky as they finally saw Charleston in the distance, the church steeples and commercial buildings that marked the city's skyline, the masts of ships in the harbor that represented their possible salvation. But daylight was their enemy. In darkness they were anonymous, could move with some degree of safety. In light they were immediately identifiable as enslaved people without obvious supervision, targets for any white person who felt like exercising their authority to demand explanations. They reached the outskirts of the city just as the sun broke fully over the horizon. Charleston was already stirring. Merchants opening shops, dock workers beginning their shifts, the daily commerce of a city built on slave labor and international trade beginning its rhythmic operations. Marcus and Sarah tried to blend into the growing crowds, walking with purpose as if they belonged, as if they had every right to be there. The Anchor Tavern was in the dock district, Thomas had said. Marcus led them toward the waterfront, weaving through streets that smelled of salt water and fish and tar from the shipbuilding yards. His back was on fire, the night's exertions having reopened some of his wounds, and he could feel blood soaking through his shirt. But he couldn't stop, couldn't show weakness. They were so close now, close to Abraham, close to possible passage north, close to the freedom they had risked everything to achieve. They found the Anchor in a narrow street near the commercial wharves, a weathered building with a painted sign showing a ship's anchor. It was early enough that the tavern wasn't yet open for regular business, but the door was unlocked. Marcus and Sarah slipped inside, finding themselves in a dim room that smelled of old beer and tobacco smoke. Behind the bar, a black man was stacking glasses, free judging by his confident bearing and the fact that he owned a business, but carrying the careful wariness that all black people in the South learned, regardless of their legal status. "We're closed," he said without looking up. "Come back at noon. We're looking for Abraham," Marcus said quietly, closing the door behind them. The man's hands stilled on the glasses. He looked up, his eyes taking in their disheveled appearance, Marcus's blood-stained shirt, Sarah's torn dress and scratched arms. Understanding dawned on his face, followed immediately by calculation. "I don't know anyone by that name," he said carefully. "Thomas sent us," Marcus said, pulling out the travel papers as a gesture of good faith. "From the Whitmore plantation. He said Abraham could help us get north." The man studied them for a long moment, and Marcus could see the internal debate happening, the desire to help warring with the very real danger of being caught harboring runaways. Then slowly, he nodded. "I'm Abraham," he said. "And you two have maybe an hour before this city is flooded with slave catchers looking for you. Mrs. Whitmore's husband arrived home this morning, and he's not happy about missing property. He's offering a reward, significant money for your return." Marcus felt his stomach drop. A reward meant every white person in Charleston would be looking for them, meant bounty hunters would be mobilized, meant their chances of escaping had just become even more infinitesimal. "Can you help us?" he asked, hearing the desperation in his own voice. Abraham moved to the door and locked it, then gestured for them to follow him to a back room. "There's a ship leaving this afternoon. The Northern Star heading for Philadelphia with a cargo of cotton and rice. Captain's a Quaker, sympathetic to the cause but careful about it. He won't take runaways on deck, but he's willing to look the other way if people happen to stow away in his cargo hold. Problem is, getting you aboard in broad daylight without being seen." "We'll find a way," Sarah said firmly. "We've come this far." Abraham looked at her, then at Marcus, and something in his expression softened. "You're brave," he said. "Both of you. Foolish maybe, but brave. The odds of making it all the way to Philadelphia without being caught are slim. You know that, right? Even if you get on the ship, even if you make it to a free state, there are slave catchers who operate in the North, bounty hunters who make a living dragging runaways back south. The fugitive slave law means you're never truly safe, not anywhere in this country." "Then we keep running," Marcus said. "To Canada if we have to anywhere that doesn't consider us property. We can't go back, we won't go back. Whatever it takes, whatever the risk, we keep going forward." Abraham studied them a moment longer, then pulled out a pocket watch and checked the time. "Ship leaves at 3 this afternoon. Between now and then, you stay hidden here. I'll bring you food, clean clothes, bandages for those wounds. When the time comes, I'll have someone create a distraction on the docks, a fight, an accident, something to draw attention away from the Northern Star. You'll have maybe 5 minutes to get aboard and find a hiding place in the cargo hold. After that, you're on your own. If you're discovered during the voyage, the captain will have to turn you over at the next port to avoid being charged with harboring fugitives. Understand?" They both nodded. Abraham opened a trapdoor in the floor, revealing a cramped space beneath, a hiding place that had clearly been used before, blankets and water jugs already stashed there. "Get in," he said, "and pray that your luck holds for just a few more hours." Marcus and Sarah climbed down into the hiding place. It was barely large enough for both of them, dark and claustrophobic, smelling of earth and old wood. Abraham lowered the trapdoor above them, and they were plunged into complete darkness, left with nothing but each other and the sound of their own breathing and the terrifying knowledge that they were now utterly dependent on the help of a stranger who was risking his own freedom to give them a chance at theirs. Time lost meaning in the darkness beneath the tavern floor. Marcus and Sarah huddled together in the cramped space, their bodies pressed close not just for comfort, but from necessity. The hiding place was barely large enough to contain them both. Above, they could hear the muffled sounds of the tavern opening for business, footsteps crossing the floor, voices raised in conversation and laughter. Each sound made them tense, wondering if this would be the moment someone discovered them, if the trapdoor would fly open to reveal Crawford's face or the barrel of a gun. Marcus's back throbbed with a deep, persistent ache that radiated through his entire body. The wounds had definitely reopened during the night's flight, and he could feel blood sticky against his shirt. In the darkness, he couldn't assess how bad it was, couldn't tell if infection was setting in, but it didn't matter. They had committed to this path. And there was no medical attention available even if he needed it. He would simply have to endure, to survive on willpower, and the desperate human capacity to push past pain when survival demanded it. Sarah's breathing beside him was shallow and quick, not from exertion now, but from fear. He found her hand in the darkness and held it, offering what comfort he could through touch when words seemed inadequate. They had been together 10 years, had learned each other's rhythms and moods, could communicate volumes through a simple squeeze of fingers. Now, trapped in darkness and waiting for a freedom that might never come, that silent communication was all they had. Hours crawled by. At some point, the trapdoor lifted briefly and Abraham's face appeared, backlit by lamplight that seemed blinding after the prolonged darkness. He passed down food, bread and cheese and apples, and a canteen of water along with clean clothes and bandages. 2 hours until the ship leaves, he said quietly. There's search parties all over the city. They're checking every black person they see, demanding papers, making arrests. You picked the worst possible time to run. Is there ever a good time? Marcus asked, his voice rough. Abraham's expression was grim. No, he admitted. I suppose there isn't, but sometimes are less terrible than others. He started to lower the trapdoor, then paused. Whatever happens in the next few hours, know this. You've already won something they can never take back. You've shown them that you're human enough to risk everything for freedom, human enough to love each other more than you fear death. That matters. Even if it ends badly, it matters. The trapdoor closed again, returning them to darkness. Sarah helped Marcus remove his blood-soaked shirt and clean the wounds on his back as best she could in the confined space, her fingers gentle despite the awkward angle and lack of light. Some of the deeper cuts had indeed reopened, and Marcus bit back groans as she applied Abraham's salve and wrapped fresh bandages around his torso. When she finished, he put on the clean shirt Abraham had provided, simple homespun that wouldn't attract attention, the kind of clothing free black laborers might wear. How does it feel? Sarah asked. Like I've been whipped and then ran 10 miles through a swamp, Marcus said, attempting levity he didn't feel. But I can move, that's enough. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Marcus, if we're caught, if this doesn't work, I want you to know that these past few days, this choice to run together, it's been the most alive I've felt in years. Even terrified, even hiding in the dark, I feel more human than I did serving Mrs. Whitmore and pretending to be grateful for my enslavement. Marcus pulled her close, careful of his injured back, and pressed his forehead against hers. We're going to make it, he said, though he had no way of knowing if it was true. We're going to get on that ship, and we're going to sail to Philadelphia, and we're going to build a life where no one owns us. We're going to have children who are born free, who never know what it's like to be property. We're going to grow old together without fear of being sold apart. That's the future we're fighting for. I hope you're right, Sarah whispered. God, I hope you're right. The final 2 hours passed with agonizing slowness. They could hear the tavern growing more crowded as the afternoon progressed, voices rising in volume as alcohol flowed. At one point, they heard a commotion that made their hearts stop. Shouting, the sound of furniture scraping, heavy footsteps moving through the building. Marcus positioned himself between Sarah and the trap door, prepared to fight if it opened, to give her whatever chance he could to escape, even though he knew it would be futile. But the trap door remained closed. Eventually, the commotion subsided, and Abraham's voice could be heard placating someone, explaining something in tones too low to make out words. Then silence, or as close to silence as the tavern ever achieved. Finally, the trap door lifted. Abraham's face appeared, his expression tense. Time, he said simply. The distraction's about to start. When you hear glass breaking and shouting, you run for the docks. The Northern Star is third from the south end, green hull with white trim. The cargo hold entrance is on the starboard side, right side if you're facing the bow. There will be crates stacked near the opening. Get behind them and stay absolutely still and silent. The crew will be loading cargo for another hour after you board. If you make noise, if you're discovered, there's nothing more I can do. Marcus and Sarah climbed out of their hiding place, their legs cramping and unsteady after hours of confinement. Abraham led them through the back of the tavern to a door that opened onto an alley. The afternoon sun was harsh after the darkness, making them squint and shield their eyes. The sounds of the docks were loud here. Men shouting, cargo being loaded and unloaded, the creak of ship's rigging and the cry of gulls. Thank you, Marcus said, gripping Abraham's hand, for risking this, for helping us. Abraham's grip was firm, his eyes serious. Help the next person who needs it, he said. That's how we survive this, by helping each other, by refusing to let this system make us as cruel and heartless as the people who benefit from it. Now go, and may God protect you. A crash of breaking glass erupted from somewhere nearby, followed by angry shouting. Abraham gave them a small push. "Now!" he urged. Marcus and Sarah ran from the alley onto the street that fronted the docks. All around them, people were turning toward the source of the disturbance, a fight that had broken out between two groups of dock workers, punches being thrown, a crowd gathering to watch. In the chaos, two more black people running toward the ships barely registered. They wove through the crowd, Marcus pulling Sarah along, his eyes fixed on the green-hulled ship Abraham had described. The Northern Star was a merchant vessel, perhaps 80 feet long, its deck busy with crew members preparing for departure. The cargo hold entrance was exactly where Abraham had said it would be, a rectangular opening in the deck, with wooden stairs leading down into darkness. Crates were being loaded by a chain of workers passing boxes hand to hand, their attention focused on their task rather than their surroundings. Marcus and Sarah reached the ship and climbed aboard, trying to look purposeful rather than furtive. No one challenged them. In the controlled chaos of departure preparations, two more bodies on deck weren't immediately noteworthy. They reached the cargo hold entrance and descended the stairs quickly, plunging into the dim interior that smelled of cotton and burlap and the peculiar mustiness of enclosed spaces on ships. The hold was crowded with cargo, bales of cotton stacked to the ceiling, barrels of rice, crates of various goods all secured with rope and netting to prevent shifting during the voyage. Marcus led Sarah toward the far corner, behind a wall of cotton bales, where they found a narrow space perhaps 3 feet wide and 5 feet deep. They squeezed into it, arranging themselves so they could sit with their backs against the hull, hidden from casual observation by the cargo surrounding them. "We made it," Sarah breathed, hardly daring to believe it. "We're actually on the ship." "Not yet," Marcus cautioned. "We're not safe until we're at sea, and even then," he didn't finish the sentence. They both knew the dangers that remained: discovery during the voyage, capture upon arrival in Philadelphia, the long reach of the fugitive slave law that made even free states dangerous for runaways. They settled into their hiding place and waited. Above them, they could hear the continued loading of cargo, the voices of sailors preparing the ship for departure. Time passed. An hour, maybe more. Their space was cramped and uncomfortable, but after the night in the marsh and the hours beneath the tavern floor, discomfort had become something they barely registered. All that mattered was remaining hidden, remaining silent, surviving the next few hours until the ship left port and the possibility of recapture diminished. Finally, they heard the calls that signaled imminent departure. Sailors shouting orders, the creak of ropes being loosened, the distinctive sound of sails being raised. The ship began to move, a gentle rocking at first, then more pronounced as it left the dock and entered the harbor. Marcus felt tears on his face and didn't bother to wipe them away. They were moving. They were leaving Charleston, leaving South Carolina, leaving, however temporarily, the immediate reach of those who claimed to own them. Sarah leaned against him, her body shaking with silent sobs of relief and exhaustion and residual terror. Marcus wrapped his arms around her, mindful of his injured back, and held her as the ship gained speed, as Charleston receded behind them, as they sailed toward an uncertain future that was nonetheless theirs to shape rather than have imposed upon them. The voyage to Philadelphia would take several days. They would need to ration the small amount of food and water they had managed to bring, would need to remain absolutely silent during the day when crew members might be working in the hold, would need to manage the basic necessities of human existence in a space barely large enough to accommodate them. But these were solvable problems, manageable challenges. They had survived the impossible, the escape itself, the flight through the marsh, the navigation to Charleston, the boarding of the ship. Everything else felt almost trivial by comparison. As night fell and the ship sailed north through dark waters, Marcus and Sarah sat together in their hiding place and talked quietly about the future they would build. They spoke of finding work in Philadelphia, of saving money, of perhaps continuing north to Canada, where they would be truly beyond the reach of slave catchers. They talked about the children they might have someday, about the stories they would tell those children about the night they ran for freedom. They made plans and dreamed dreams, exercising the most fundamental human right, the right to imagine a future and work toward it. 3 days into the voyage, as the ship approached Philadelphia harbor, they heard footsteps descending into the cargo hold. They froze, pressing themselves back into their hiding place, barely daring to breathe. A lantern appeared, casting moving shadows across the bales of cotton. Then a voice, old, gravelly, speaking in the distinctive accent of a Pennsylvania Quaker. "I know thee are down here," the voice said. "Abraham sent word ahead. I am Captain Morrison. "Thee need not fear, I will not betray thee, but we are approaching port, and thee must remain hidden until nightfall, until the customs inspectors have finished their work and departed. Then I will help thee leave the ship safely. There are people in Philadelphia who aid fugitives, who will help thee on thy journey north. Thee have shown great courage to come this far. Do not falter now when safety is within reach." The footsteps retreated, the lantern light faded, and Marcus and Sarah were left in darkness again. But it was a different darkness now, not the darkness of the unknown, but the darkness that comes just before dawn, the last shadow before light breaks through. They had made it, against all odds. Despite every barrier the system of slavery had erected to prevent exactly this, they had escaped. They were not yet free in the fullest sense. That would require reaching Canada, would require years of constant vigilance and caution. But they were free in the way that mattered most. Free in their own minds, free in their recognition of their own humanity, free in their refusal to accept the definitions imposed on them by those who had claimed ownership of their bodies and souls. As the ship docked in Philadelphia and the sounds of the busy harbor filtered down into the cargo hold, Marcus took Sarah's hand and held it tight. "Whatever comes next," he said, "we face it together, as free people, as husband and wife, as human beings with the right to determine our own path." Sarah squeezed his hand in return. "Together," she agreed, "always together." And in that cramped, dark space in the hold of a ship, surrounded by cargo produced by the labor of people still enslaved, two people who had dared to claim their own humanity celebrated the victory of simply being alive, being together, being free. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of things, two people out of millions still trapped in bondage, two drops in an ocean of suffering. But it was their victory, earned through courage and love and the stubborn human refusal to accept dehumanization as fate. The story of Marcus and Sarah was one of thousands of similar stories that unfolded during the centuries of American slavery. Stories of resistance, of escape, of people who risked everything for the chance to be recognized as human. Some succeeded, reaching free soil and building new lives. Many more failed, were recaptured, were punished with brutality designed to discourage others from attempting the same. But each attempt, each act of resistance, each refusal to accept slavery as natural or permanent, chipped away at the foundations of the institution, and eventually, through the combined efforts of enslaved people who resisted, abolitionists who worked for change, and the terrible violence of civil war, those foundations crumbled and slavery ended. But the legacy remained, in the racial hierarchies that persisted after emancipation, in the systems of oppression that evolved to replace chains with other forms of control, in the ongoing struggle for true equality and recognition of full humanity for all people, regardless of race. Marcus and Sarah's story was not just history, it was prologue, the beginning of a longer story about freedom and justice, and the human capacity for both tremendous cruelty and tremendous courage. As darkness fell over Philadelphia, and Captain Morrison returned to guide them from their hiding place and into the uncertain freedom of the North, Marcus and Sarah stepped out of the hold and onto the deck of the Northern Star. They breathed free air, looked up at stars that belonged to no one, and began the next chapter of their journey, a journey that would continue for the rest of their lives and echo through the lives of their descendants, a testament to the power of human will and the fundamental truth that no person can truly own another, no matter what the law might say. Thank you for watching this powerful story of resistance and resilience. If you found this narrative meaningful, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel for more forgotten histories. We bring these stories to light because they matter, because they remind us of both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human courage. Drop a comment below telling us what you thought of Marcus and Sarah's journey and where in the world you're watching from. These stories connect us across time and space, reminding us of our shared humanity and our ongoing responsibility to fight for justice and freedom for all people.